Hello there and welcome to this tutorial. My name's Barry Beckham and this month we're going to be adding some mystery and intrigue to our landscape here by adding a realistic mist effect. So what is it about a misty day that turns almost any scene we care to shoot into a more dramatic and interesting picture? It probably is the mystery and intrigue that the actual mist generates, and sometimes the mist can hide a multitude of sins, the housing estate at the end of the park, a row of cars that normally would spoil a picture. Well, in this image we don't need to conceal an unwanted row of cars. What we do hope to do is to add some charm and interest to our image. As you can see, we're going to be using Adobe Photoshop Elements 2 for this tutorial. And many of you may have this software, which came bundled with either a flatbed scanner or a printer or another piece of hardware. But don't forget, you can carry out this tutorial using any version of Photoshop 2. To start the manipulations, we need to create a new blank layer, which is going to house the mist we're going to create. So let's create the new layer by going to the Layer menu and choosing New Layer. And Photoshop Elements gives us a box to enable us to label the layer, so why not use that? And I'm going to click OK. We can take a peek into the Layers palette in Photoshop Elements by hitting the F11 key. And there we can see the background, which is our image, and there we can see the new blank layer that's ready to accept the mist we're now going to create. Now, if we're going to create our mist on this new blank layer, we need to choose a colour. And we can do that via the colour picker from the toolbox. I'm going to click the black there. And I'm going to choose an off-white colour, which is going to be right up the top left there. Almost looks white, but not quite. Maybe that's a little bit too dark. I'm going to lighten it just a little bit and click OK. It's only when we see the colour we've selected alongside white that we can tell that we haven't, in actual fact, got a nice off-white colour. To apply that colour and to start the process of creating a band of mist in the distance on our image, I'm going to turn to the toolbox and the gradient tool. Now we need to look at some of the options of the gradient tool. The one to the far left of these options is the one we need to choose, and as you can see, it's called linear gradient. And from the drop down box here, we need to choose foreground to transparent. Once we've done that, we can create our gradient, and Photoshop and Photoshop Elements allows us to draw a line which tells the software where to start and end the gradation. So I'm going to remove my Layers palette so we've got a clear screen, and let's give that a whirl. Now I'm going to start my gradient down the bottom area of the picture. I'm going to click about here and drag a elasticated line up the picture space. Now this would create a gradient on an angle, which we don't require, so we need to keep this line more or less vertical. If we want to be sure it's absolutely vertical, then hold the Shift key down. Once we've done that, we can release the key and the gradient is formed. We can now select the Move tool from the top right of the toolbox, and we can click and we can drag the gradient up the picture space. And I'm going to drag it up so that I've got a nice gradient over the middle distance. We may not have it in perfect position, but we can always change it a little bit more later. We now need to select the Eraser tool from the toolbox to erase the bottom half of this mist to give us that lovely thin band of mist that we quite often see in the morning. Now, as you can see, I've chosen quite a large soft edge brush, and you can see the size is 300 pixels here, but we may need to vary that and make that smaller as we begin to erase the bottom edge here. And we can do that using the bracket keys to the right of the letter P on the keyboard. There's two sets of bracket keys, the square bracket keys. The one on the left will scroll the brush size down, as you can see on screen, and the one on the right will scroll the brush size up. Much better to look at the brush size in relation to the job we wish to do and use those keys. We also need to reduce the opacity of the Eraser tool, and we can do that from the options bar and this slider here. Just somewhere around about 50% will do. We can always drop it down if we find we're erasing too quickly, or we can increase it if we find we're not erasing fast enough. We also need the image enlarged, and to save us having to keep switching tools in the toolbox, this is a nice tip. Hold the Alt key and the spacebar together and we get the zoom tool in its minus mode. Hold the Control key and the spacebar together and we get the zoom tool in its plus mode, and we can drag out our square shape and instantly enlarge the image. And as we release those two keys, we jump back to the previous tool that we had selected. So now we can start to erase along this bottom line. And this task needs to be quite delicate and quite gradual because it needs to form the shape of the mist, that thin band of mist that we often see. And when we move to the edge of the screen, we're running out of space on the left here. Another great shortcut is to just hold down the space bar. A little hand will appear. There's a little hand there. We can click and drag our image to the right, and when we release the space bar, the hand disappears and we're back to the original tool. A great way of finding our way around an enlarged image. 3 to 4 minutes of careful erasing should bring us to this stage. But if you look carefully at the image, we may need to add some more mist elsewhere. If we look at this dark wedge shape here, we wouldn't expect that to be quite as dark as it is, so we need to actually do something about that next. Now that's best done on another new blank layer. So let's open the Layers palette with the F11 key, and we can create a new blank layer in a different way this time. Instead of using the layer menu here, we can click this icon here and a new blank layer will be created. And if we need to rename the layer, we can just double click it and type in a name of our choice and hit the enter key. So with that new blank layer created, we can go to the toolbox and select a brush tool from the toolbar, and once again we need to select a soft edge brush, and there's a nice soft one, although it's a little bit on the small side, so I'm going to use the bracket keys to make it larger. And I'm going to adjust the opacity of the tool because we're going to be spraying the mist colour we selected earlier. So I'm going to take the opacity of the tool down to 10% to start and see what sort of effect we get as we start to brush some of the mist into this dark area. We can now gently spray in some colour, and there's not too much colour appearing at the moment with our setting at 10%. We can just see a little bit appearing now. So that may be a little bit on the low side. So I'm going to push that up to 40% and start the spraying process again. And now we can start to see we're having an effect. And we need to be careful again about how much we put into this. And it's best if we do this enlarged. We shouldn't really be working on this image at the size you can see on screen. So let's go back to the zoom tool and zoom in really large on that area. Then go back to select our brush. We can even adjust the brush size a little bit, and we can start to paint in a little bit more mist down here. And of course mist does seem to float about in a landscape, so if we get it a little bit on the patchy side, probably it's not going to hurt too much at all. So let's hit the shortcut keys Control 0 to fit the image back on screen, and you can see that we're starting to have some effect on the image. Now if you notice this slight lined effect here, don't be too alarmed by that. It's just our screen resolution. If I zoom in a couple of clicks, you can see that it is in fact quite smooth, so we can safely ignore it and it wouldn't come out on any print that we made later on. So let's go back to our paintbrush tool, and you can see now how we add extra mist on the third layer in any place on our image where we feel it needs it. So once we've added some more mist onto that third layer, we can open up the Layers palette using that F11 key and select the background, because what we're going to do next is to add some extra saturation into the background layer. And we can do that by going to Enhance, Adjust Colour, Hue and Saturation, and we can move the saturation slider to the right to put in as much colour as we feel is necessary, just to give that morning glow. And I'm just moving the palette so I can have a look around the image, and we might even be able to squeeze some more into that. And when we're happy with that, we can click OK. Well, this image is coming along quite nicely, but what it lacks is foreground interest to give the picture some good solid depth from foreground to background. So we're going to add that digitally. And this is the picture we're going to use, which is also available on this month's CD, and this image is called Misty Morning Start 2. We need to start by opening our layers palette and changing the background into a layer by double clicking that thumbnail and giving the new layer a name. And that seems appropriate. And we can now get rid of the layers palette for the moment, because the next task is to go to the magic wand tool from the toolbox, and with the tolerance set at 30 we need to click the add to a selection icon, which is the second from the left, and then click into the picture space. Taking a few seconds to select that, but it's selected quite a lot. If any areas haven't been selected, we can just click into those areas, such as the bottom right corner there, and also, well, the top right corner has been taken with it. And what we can do lastly is to hold down that Control and Spacebar key, drag out a shape to enlarge the image, and just have a critical look amongst all these branches, because we may find that there are some gaps that we need to click into. But once we're happy that we've got it all selected, we can then go to our Select menu and choose our Feather command. And we just need to add a 1 pixel feather radius to the selection we've just made, just so that the edges of the tree look natural when we apply the tree to our landscape image. I'm going to click OK to that. If we then go to Edit and choose Cut, there we have our tree floating on a transparent background. Now, if at this stage you find you did miss a little bit of the sky in amongst the branches of the tree, no problem, because you can still select them, still give them that 1 pixel of feather, and remove them. I'm going to reveal the landscape that's sitting behind this, which is the one we was working on earlier on. So there's the tree and the landscape on screen together. I'm going to select the Move tool from the toolbar, and I'm going to click, drag and drop the tree into the image. Now you'll notice that Photoshop Elements always leaves the original on screen, and now we can close this down. But it might be a good idea to save this to a convenient location. Should you ever need a silhouetted tree in some future composition, you may already be in possession of it. Now I'm sure you've already spotted one problem we've got to deal with, and that's the size of the tree in relation to the landscape. But first let's go to the Layers palette, because the tree is not sitting in the right place in the layered stack. There's the 2 layers for our mist, there's the basic image. We need to click and drag the tree up the stack so it's sitting on the top. Once we've done that, we're going to need to reduce the size of the image on screen. I'm going to use Alt Spacebar for that task, and I'm going to drop it down quite low, and you'll see why when we go to our Transform tools. I'm going to go to Edit, I beg your pardon, I'm going to Image, Transform, Free Transform, and there's the bounding box around the outer edge of our tree. If we had the picture too big, the bounding box is possibly going to be off screen, and therefore we can't adjust it. What we're going to do here is hold the Shift key down, drag in a corner toggle to give our tree a reasonable size and shape for the image we're applying it to. And once we get it about right, we can then enlarge the picture and have a look. Hold down the Control Spacebar again, click the picture, bring it up a bit bigger, and now we can take a more critical look with the bounding box still in place. And I'm going to bring that down just a wee bit more. It's going to be positioned just about there. And once we're happy with that, we can hit the Enter key to commit that transformation. It will take a couple of seconds because this is quite a task that we're asking Photoshop to do. Now if we were to enlarge a small part of this tree, we can see just a tiny hint here of a halo around the outer edge. We can fix that by opening our Layers palette via the F11 key, and from the drop down blend modes I'm going to choose Darken, and if you look at the halo as this is clicked, you'll see that it virtually disappears, and is certainly going to be not noticeable in the final print. So I'm going to close the layers and bring the picture back to full screen. Now there's one area here that's a bit of a problem, that's this branch here. So we need to remove that, and that can be easily removed with the eraser tool. Another alternative to erasing that branch would be to cut it out using a selection tool. So using either the freehand or the polygonal lasso tool, you could just loop around the branches you want to remove and then choose the Edit Cut or Control X from the keyboard. And that's our image just about finished. Now it would be a good idea to save your image as a Photoshop file and retain those 4 layers for the time being, just in case in a day or so's time you come back and decide that you want to add some mist or remove some mist or make the foreground interest smaller. You can do so while the picture's in its layered form. But once you're finally satisfied that all's complete and you want to save this image for longer term storage, we can go to Layer, Flatten, and if we now look into the Layers palette, Photoshop Elements has flattened all those layers into one.